The Oklahoma night lay heavy and cold, a silence broken only by the occasional hum of cars on the desolate road. From one of these cars, a bundle of fur was tossed from the passenger side, landing hard on the gravel shoulder. It took Daisy, the mother dog, a few breaths to comprehend her reality. She lay there, stunned, her body bruised, but the tiny cries of her puppies beside her snapped her to attention. Daisy lifted her head, her large brown eyes searching the stretch of road for some familiar sight, but the car that had carried them was gone, leaving her and her pups exposed to the night. She nuzzled each of her babies, steadying her heartbeat to calm their frightened whimpers. The air was painfully cold, their small bodies huddled close against her for warmth, with no shelter or safety in sight. A few miles away, Max O'Donnell sat in his cabin, a mug of cold coffee forgotten in his hand. He was a man who'd grown accustomed to quiet, choosing this solitude in Oklahoma's countryside to escape the clamor of memories he had no desire to revisit. But tonight, something unsettled him. It was faint, an unshakable pull that stirred memories of his days in the service when instincts were honed sharp. He dismissed it, but then he heard it, a soft whimper floating through the night. Drawn by the sound, Max reached for his flashlight, slipped on his boots, and headed outside into the cool darkness. As he approached the source, he spotted them, a mother dog and her puppies huddled together in a fragile bundle along the road. He stopped, taking in the sight, feeling a mixture of sorrow and purpose settle over him. Max approached cautiously, speaking in low, steady tones meant to reassure. Kneeling, he extended a hand for the mother to sniff, offering her a silent promise of safety. Daisy looked up, her tired eyes meeting his, and for an instant there was a recognition, an unspoken understanding between them. With gentle care, Max gathered the mother and her pups, feeling their small bodies tremble against him as he carried them home. Back at his cabin, he placed Daisy and her puppies on a thick quilt near the warmth of the fire. They curled up, watching him with wary eyes as he brought them food and water, moving with a tenderness he hadn't realized he still possessed. Daisy's gaze softened, following his every movement, her trust growing in the face of his calm presence. As he settled into his armchair, Max found himself lost in thought. The quiet was no longer just his own. It was shared with these fragile creatures who had come into his life in such an unexpected way. In their vulnerability, he saw a mirror of his own hidden pain, the scars he carried silently. But as Daisy curled protectively around her puppies, he felt a shift within himself. Perhaps, he thought, this unexpected family held the very piece of himself he'd been missing. In the warmth of the cabin, Daisy and her puppies gradually recovered, their bodies resting in the soft embrace of Max's old quilt. The fire crackled, casting a comforting glow that softened the rugged edges of the room. Max moved quietly around them, bringing scraps of food and fresh water, keeping his distance at first. Yet with each passing day, the small family became less wary, watching him with a mix of curiosity and cautious trust. As the days blurred into one another, Max found himself drawn into a routine that felt both strange and familiar. He'd been alone for so long that sharing his space with Daisy and her pups made him uneasy at first. But there was something profoundly healing about their presence. The puppies, with their boundless curiosity and gentle yips, brought an energy into his home he hadn't felt in years. Daisy, calm and watchful, never let her gaze leave her pups, and every now and then she'd look at Max, her eyes carrying a warmth and gratitude that needed no words. One afternoon, as he sat in his worn armchair, Max absent-mindedly reached out to pet Daisy. To his surprise, she leaned into his touch, her head resting against his hand, her trust in him solidifying in that quiet gesture. He felt a pang of unexpected joy, a kind of peace that began to fill the empty corners of his heart. In Daisy's loyalty and the puppy's innocence, he saw fragments of himself, pieces he thought he'd left behind on distant battlefields. But shadows from his past were never far away. News had reached him about a group in the nearby town, notorious for abusing animals. Rumors about dogs discarded like trash gnawed at his thoughts, and he began to suspect that Daisy's abandonment might have been part of something far darker than a simple act of cruelty. As the possibility lingered, he was gripped by a bitter rage he hadn't felt in years. Sitting in the dim light of his cabin that night, Max wrestled with his thoughts. Part of him wanted to shield Daisy and her pups from the world outside, to keep them safe within the cocoon they'd created. But memories of the war, of the lives he'd seen shattered, haunted him. He knew that ignoring a wrong once seen was a betrayal of his own conscience. He would have to make a choice. Late into the night, Daisy seemed to sense his turmoil, shifting closer to him with a reassuring nudge. Her calm presence steadied him, grounding him in the simple act of her trust. Max took a deep breath, knowing what he had to do. Protecting Daisy meant facing the darkness that had once claimed his peace, but if he could shield her from harm, perhaps he could finally heal his own wounds. In that moment, Max found his resolve. Max woke early the next morning with a newfound sense of purpose. The sun cast a golden light over the quiet landscape as he glanced at Daisy, still curled protectively around her pups. He knew what he had to do, but the weight of his past settled on him as he prepared. Memories of the battles he'd fought and the wounds he carried lingered. Yet this was different. Protecting Daisy and her pups felt like a calling he could not ignore. He spent the morning gathering information, discreetly asking around town about the group rumored to be involved in the abuse and abandonment of animals. His questions were met with cautious glances and vague answers, but Max was persistent. Piece by piece, he uncovered disturbing details about a small circle of individuals who had been exploiting dogs for illegal activities, casting them aside once they were of no use. As he returned to the cabin that evening, he found Daisy waiting at the door, her gaze steady, as if sensing the path he was about to take. She didn't flinch as he knelt beside her, his hand resting on her soft fur. "I promise," he whispered, "I won't let anyone hurt you again." In the early hours, he drove toward the place he'd been directed, a rundown property on the outskirts of town. The sight was enough to stoke the fury within him, a makeshift pen holding several malnourished dogs, their eyes dull and defeated. Max felt his chest tighten, but he pushed forward, slipping through the shadows to free them one by one. The dogs, though fearful, seemed to sense his intentions, following him as he led them to safety. When Max confronted the individuals responsible, his voice was calm but unyielding. He spoke not just for Daisy and her pups, but for every animal discarded by those who saw them as worthless. The confrontation was swift, his resolve unwavering, and by the time he left, he knew he'd done what he had to. The authorities were notified, and a small piece of justice had been served. Returning to the cabin, Max felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Daisy greeted him, her tail wagging, and he knelt to embrace her, feeling a bond that went beyond words. In that moment, he understood that Daisy and her pups had saved him as much as he'd saved them. As the fire crackled softly, Max knew that he was no longer alone, that a new chapter had begun for all of them.